So this program we're calling Jewish Jazz, and it's a really fun program that's going to explore the connections between klezmer-style music that sort of was transported from Eastern Europe over to New York in the turn of the 20th century, when basically 1/3 of the Jewish population of Eastern Europe immigrated over to the United States between 1880 and 1920, bringing with them this musical style. And that's klezmer style then emerged with African-American music that was coming up from the South during the Great Migration. Many of them people moving to New York, bringing ragtime and the blues, and ultimately that all coalesces into this wonderful thing we call jazz and swing. And some of the great early clarinet artists in that world, Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw that you'll hear today, were Jewish, of course, and trained themselves in the synagogue. So there's a real connection between all of these musics that I hope that you'll see in this show. Now, music and the Jews go back a long way. You can go back to the Genesis in the Bible. Musicians are mentioned among the 3 fundamental professions, the other 2 being herding and tool forging. So we don't do those well, but musicians are there. It was really seen as a necessity to everyday life. And the klezmer groups that would sort of form, klezmer really just means, clay means vessel, zmer means song, it's a vessel of song. Klezmer, and then it sort of got transported to being the musicians themselves. They were the klezmorim, the klezmer musicians. Now, in the beginning, the clarinet was not really a part of klezmer music. It was a softer kind of music. Violin was the main instrument that was used, partly because a lot of the edicts in Russia at that time forbade very loud music from going on in the folk areas. But interestingly enough, in the 19th century, when the Tsar began sort of taking in Jews to go into the army to fight, many of them joined the military bands and got given clarinets and other woodwind instruments, and then they brought those back to their shtetls and their villages, and the clarinet sort of took over for the violin and was a little bit more brassy or louder sound. The piano was certainly not a part of it because, for the most part, it was still illegal for these klezmerim to be playing, and if the authorities came, they had to be able to run fast, and it's hard to run fast with a piano on your back. Sometimes you'd have accordions, but the piano really only joins klezmer when it comes to New York and gets metamorphosized in that way. So what we're going to do is sort of explore that connection there and how that klezmer music made its way over. And we're going to start with this little suite we call the Jewish Suite. It's written by an Italian clarinetist named Michele Magnani, who was born, I believe, in 1967 and is the director of many kind of bands in Italy, but writes some really wonderful pieces, and you'll hear another one at the beginning of the second half. This one just gives us a flavor of that Jewish quality. I always say about Jewish music, you know it when you hear it, kind of like what Potter Stewart said about pornography. You know it when you see it. But there's just something about that music, as of course there's the scale as part of sort of an augmented second part of the scale that has its connection as well to Arabic music, and the blues is in there, so the scale is all connected, but you hear that in this Jewish suite. 4 short little movements, and we hope you enjoy it. Here's Michele Magnani. Okay, so that's the klezmer side of this. Now, at the same time, and especially in that first decade of the 20th century, there was a kind of a new music making its way up the Mississippi, and ultimately into New York, and then across the ocean. And that is what we call ragtime music, which sadly got lost really once jazz came along in the 20s and was not refound until the 60s, and then in the 1970s, the great movie The Sting came out. We've had a revival of this music, but it was a fascinating music, and it had a sort of a syncopation, ragging of the rhythm that excited a lot of people that heard it. It started off in the brothels and the saloons, the African-American saloons down in the Mississippi, and many of the early ragtime piano players, it was just sort of something to do while bad things were going on around you, the performers really couldn't write or read music a lot. They basically improvised this, made up a great rag, and the next day they came up with another rag. And it was not until Scott Joplin came along and began to write these down. And he had a wonderful training. Joplin was born in 1868 in Texarkana, Arkansas. His mom was a cleaner for a lot of the white people in town, and so she would sometimes bring along young Scott when she was cleaning, and if there was a piano in the house when he was 5 or 6 years old, he would just run over to that piano and start playing, and word spread about him, and there happened to be a Jewish guy living in the area named Julius Weiss, who then decided he would give free lessons to Scott Joplin, taught him on piano, but also taught him to read music and all of the theory, and so that when Joplin was finally ready to make his move in the music world, he had all of this training. He came from a musical family. Unfortunately, his mother dies when he's 13 years old, and his father said, now it's time to get down to a real job. And at that point, Scott left and decided he wanted to be a musician. And when he was 13 years old, he started traveling along the Mississippi, listening to all the great ragtime pianists play, getting all of their great ideas. He ends up in Sedalia, Missouri, and working at the Maple Leaf Club there. That's where he would write his Maple Leaf Rag, not named after Canada in any way, and then followed soon after with The Entertainer, which we'll play in a second, and that was the piece that was used as the theme for The Sting, and is also always on ice cream trucks when he goes by, is considered one of the great songs of the 20th century, and then we'll also do The Easy Winners, another piece that he wrote soon after. Sadly for Joplin did not think of himself as a ragtime pianist. He thought of himself as a real classical musician, and in fact, he dreamed of writing an opera, and he did write an opera, opera called Tremonisha. And unfortunately, Joplin moved to New York later in his life, and he was able to play a little bit of this opera for some of the crowd up in Harlem, trying to get investors it's a big opera. He played a piano part, he had a few actors. It was not a great rendition of it, and nobody invested. A year later, he would die penniless in a pauper's grave, and never saw his opera produced. Although before he died, he told somebody, in 50 years, they will listen to my music. And he was absolutely correct. He died, I believe, in 1917. In the 1960s, as I mentioned, there's some new books that come out about ragtime. Joshua Rifkin, the pianist, begins to play all of Joplin's music. And then the Sting comes out, and soon after the Sting came out, the Atlanta Opera produced Tremonisha for the first time. It's a huge 4-hour giant opera, and the music is great. The plot is not so good, but it needed some editing.
How is that different from
from all operas? I mean, we listen to Wagner, I don't know why. It really should be done more, and I think if he had had the time to edit it out, there would have been a really great opera. But it was really one of the first to have that kind of ragtime feel to it. Now, ragtime really was amazing to those who listened to it for the first time. We have this wonderful letter that a German tourist who had come here in 1903 wrote back to his wife about after he heard ragtime. He said, "Suddenly, I discovered that my legs were in a condition of great excitement. They twitched as though charged with electricity and betrayed a considerable and rather dangerous desire to jerk me from my seat. The rhythm of the music, which had seemed so unnatural at first, began to exert its influence over me. It wasn't that feeling of ease in the joints of the feet and the toes which might be caused by a Strauss waltz. No, it was much more energetic, material, independent, as though one had encountered a balking horse, which is absolutely impossible to master." Now, as this music spread into the Midwest, where there are actually a number of wonderful women ragtime composers from the Midwest that we are just discovering a lot of their music, goes up to New York, and as I said, across. But as it spreads, white people become very scared, as they often do when black music begins to seep into the culture. It happened with rock and roll music, with rap music, and they start feeling that maybe this is dangerous music and will destroy the minds of the youth. And we have some essays from Musical America. This is 1909. "How can we regard this invasion of vulgarity in music other than as a national calamity? This cheap, trashy stuff could not elevate even the most degraded minds, nor could it possibly urge anyone to greater effort in the acquisition of culture in any phase. There is no element of intellectuality in the enjoyment of ragtime. It savors too much of the primitive conception of music, whose basis was a rhythm that appealed to the physical rather than the mental senses." Obviously filled with racist overtones and not just horrible ideas, but this began to spread in society, and people began to back off of it. One guy who really loved this music was the Russian composer Igor Stravinsky, who wrote in an article in the New York Tribune, "I know little about American music, except ragtime, but I consider that music unrivaled. It is veritable art, and I never can get enough of it to satisfy me. I am convinced of the absolute truth of utterance in that form of American art," and then he finishes saying, "God forbid that you Americans should ever compose symphonies and fugues." So not very nice, but he did like the ragtime. All right, now it's the time for this good story.
Oh, okay. So this story is a little bit apocryphal. It might be true. And it revolves around how ragtime changed human history, modern history. And, in the final years of the Tsarist Empire in Russia, Tsar Nicholas II, his right-hand man was the great mastermind of his rule, Rasputin. And some of the other nobility, the oligarchs, were getting apprehensive of Rasputin's power and influence, so a plot was hatched to assassinate him. So the head of the plot, again, I don't have the notes in front of you, is an encounter, a duke, invited Rasputin over to his house. And the idea was he was going to kill Rasputin. But this noble person was a big fan of American music and had two very unusual things in his home. A Victrola, this is like 1913 or something, a Victrola, and a record in early '78 made by a singer named Billy Murray, not Bill Murray, Billy Murray, of the brand new hit by Irving Berlin, Alexander's Ragtime Band. Which had nothing to do with Tsar Alexander. Anyway, and the story goes that when it was time for this nobleman to do the deed, he put on that record. And Rasputin was just mesmerized and like, first of all, he'd never even heard a record player, period, let alone an American ragtime piece. And the story goes, Rasputin was just, basically and went over to this record and just stared at it, and that's when he was stabbed in the back and killed. So the takeaway from that story is, while listening to ragtime music, watch your back.
And you do also have to be careful because it's dangerous stuff. I got one more essay, one more from Musical America. This is 1918. The counters of our music stores are now loaded with this virulent poison, which in the form of a malarious epidemic is finding its way into the homes and the brains of our youth to such an extent as to arouse one's suspicions of their sanity. If this is an evil music that has crept into the hearts of our American people and must be wiped out, as other bad and dangerous epidemics have been exterminated. A person once inoculated with the ragtime fever is like one addicted to strong drink. Ragtime is syncopation gone mad, and its victims, in my opinion, can only be treated successfully like a dog with rabies.
I'm not going to say that that's right or wrong, but I will point out that every single person who attended our previous two concerts here last night and this afternoon has already turned to a life of crime.
Oh, that's Okay, now, when I first came up for the title of this, Jewish Jazz, I kind of liked the alliteration and everything, but I wanted to see if anybody else had used that title, so I did a quick internet search, and one of the top things that came up was a title of an article. It was called Jewish Jazz Becomes Our National Music. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. So I opened it up, and it actually is from 1924, but it's from the Dearborn Independent, written by Henry Ford. Now, most of you might know that Henry Ford was one of the great anti-Semites of all time, one of Hitler's favorite people. In fact, Hitler had a portrait of him in his bunker. And Ford wrote some really horrifying things. When I was young, my father would never have a Ford. I never understood until I read some of these how he felt. But Ford recognized that there was something going on, especially in New York, where the African Americans and the Jews were sort of getting together, and that music was sort of flooding it in, like we heard in that Musical America quotes. And he wrote the following: "Many people have wondered whence come the waves upon waves of musical slush that invade decent parlors and set the young people of this generation imitating the drivel of morons. Jazz is a Jewish creation. The mush, the slush, the sly suggestion, the abandoned sensuousness of sliding notes are of Jewish origin." Now, of course, this is not true, but there is some links to what was going on in klezmer music, the way you can slide around on these instruments that have some links to the African-American music, but the connection of that was what was fascinating. Now, he starts talking about Tin Pan Alley and the horror of that area in New York. He said, "The song pluggers of theater, vaudeville, and radio are the paid agents of the Yiddish song agencies. Money and not merit dominates the spread of this moron music, which is called Jewish jazz and swing. Non-Jewish music is stigmatized as highbrow. The people are fed from day to day on the moron suggestiveness that flows in a slimy flood out of Tin Pan Alley, the head factory of filth in New York, which is populated by the Abies, the Izzies, and the Moes, who make up the composing staffs of the various institutions. Tin Pan Alley is the name given to the region in 28th Street between Broadway and 6th Avenue, where the first Yiddish song manufacturers began business. Flocks of young girls who thought they could sing, and others who thought they could write songs, came to the neighborhood, allured by the dishonest advertisements that promised more than the budding Yiddish promoters could fulfill. Needless to say, scandal became rampant, as it always does when so-called Gentile girls are reduced to the necessity of seeking favors from the Jew. It was the constant shouting of voices, the hilarity of parties, the banging of pianos, and the blaring of trombones that gave this district the name of Tin Pan Alley. All America is now one great tin pan alley. It's entertainment, it's youth, it's politics, a blare of moronic Judaism. So it's fairly horrifying when you read this. This is Henry Ford writing all of this, and it's scary. Anyways, we're going to play now a piece written by a composer born in the Soviet Union in 1927. His name is Lev Kogan, not as well known here. Grew up in the Soviet system, in fact went to the Moscow State Conservatory and studied with Aram Khachaturian, the great Armenian composer. But Kogan really was Jewish, and he wanted to bring that music out, which was dangerous to do, of course, in Soviet time, in Soviet Russia. He was somehow able to get out in 1972 and emigrated to Israel. And that's when he started to really write most of his music, wrote 250 Yiddish songs, a number of symphonies and larger pieces, but also a lot of this kind of klezmer-style music. And we're going to do something he wrote, I think, in the late 80s. These are 10, it's from a score called 10 Hasidic Tunes. We're going to do 4 of these. And again, with these, you'll hear that klezmer style, but you also hear a little bit of the jazzy quality. Of course, these are written in the 80s, but I think the slow one, the second one we do, especially has this kind of jazz quality to it. So here's Lev Kogan's Hasidic Tunes. to kind of mainstream a lot of this jazz music, get it out into a wider public, and that was the great Benny Goodman, one of the great clarinets of our century. And Benny Goodman was born in 1909, and his father was a tailor who had come over from Warsaw. His mother, Dora Brzezinski, was from Lithuania, and they actually met right here in Baltimore and fell in love.
And left! Like right away!
And immediately got out of Baltimore and went to Chicago, which is where the family grew up. And there were 12 kids. I think it was 3 boys and 9 girls. Of course, the father was not at that time able to work as a tailor as he wanted to. In his autobiography, Benny Goodman described his father's working. He said, "Pop worked in the stockyards, shoveling lard in its unrefined state. He had these boots, and he'd come home at the end of the day exhausted, stinking to high heaven. And when he walked in, it made me sick. I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand the idea of Pop every day standing in that stuff, shoveling it around." But they decided that they were going to get music lessons, at least to the boys in the family. And I forget the names. You know the names of all the kids here.
Yeah. So they went down, the synagogue the Goodman family belonged to is called Kehillat Jacob. Maybe you've heard of it. I think it's a franchise. Anyway, the synagogues, the shul, started a music program offering instruments and lessons to the children of its congregants, many of whom, like the Goodmans, were very poor. So David Goodman went down with 3 of his sons. None of his daughters, sorry. 3 of his sons to sign up for it. The oldest was Harry Goodman, who was 16 years old and supposedly a pretty stocky kid. They took one look at him at the synagogue and said, "Son, you're playing the tuba." Gave him the tuba, and he played it. It would end up switching to double bass and played professionally for many years. In fact, he played in the Benny Goodman Orchestra for many years, being, in most people's opinion, the weakest musical link in that organization. Next in age was Freddie Goodman, who was 12 years old, also a decent-sized kid. They took a look at him and said, "All right, you're going to play the trombone." Handed him the trombone. The youngest of the Goodman boys who went down that day was Benny, 10 years old, by all accounts a pretty scrawny 10-year-old. They took one look at him and said, "Boy, chick, you're going to have to play clarinet." And that's how his instrument was chosen.
Stuck with clarinet. Did a pretty good job on it, though. By the time he was 14, he was already playing in bands. Sadly, when he got his first big professional gig, that same night, his father was actually killed. He was hit by a streetcar. So his father never saw Benny grow up to be what he became, which was always something that really bothered Benny. Now, he formed this great band, and they started experimenting with this new kind of upbeat jazz, what we call swing. And it was in 1935 at the Palomar Ballroom in Los Angeles, where the first great program of this. They played the first half of this concert kind of more standard jazz, and they noticed that the audience was not really excited by it. So Gene Krupa, the great drummer from the band, at intermission supposedly went to Benny Goodman and he said, "Benny, if we're going to die out there, we should die playing what we want to play." And so that second half, they opened it up to some faster swing music, and that's how it all started, supposedly. Within a few years, they would end up in Carnegie Hall, one of the most important concerts of its time, January 16th, 1938, described by critic Bruce Eder as the single most important jazz or popular music concert in history. It was jazz's coming out party to the world of respectable music. Another critic, Will Friedlander, Friedwald said, "In bringing jazz to Carnegie Hall, Benny Goodman was, in effect, smuggling American contraband into the halls of European high culture. And Goodman and his 15 men pulled it off with the audacity and precision of Ocean's 11. So it was a great concert. It sold out weeks and weeks beforehand, all 2,700 seats. Anybody have an idea what the price was, the high price at that time?
$3.50.
Close, $2.75.
What that means is that all of you overpaid tonight.
Now, of course, the other important thing about Benny Goodman and his orchestra, it was a fully integrated orchestra. He did not believe that we had to have any of this prejudice here. In fact, he said, if a guy's got it, let him give it. I'm selling music, not prejudice. And they would often go down south and would not play in certain places that forced them not to be separated. He was also a very tough taskmaster, and once he got going, he was really tough on the orchestra. Glenn Miller, and was before he started his own orchestra, asked Benny, how do I get this thing started? And supposedly Benny said to him, how do you get started? I have no idea, but whatever you do, just don't stop. Keep on going. So he had a really good work ethic, but he also enjoyed playing. He once said, after you've done all the work and prepared as much as you can, what the hell, you might as well go out and have a good time. So he always seemed to have a good time playing. We're going to do two of his pieces, and we'll do two more in the second half. The first one's called Benji's Bubbles. Benji is one of his daughters, actually, and the second one is called Tattletale. Of course, after Benny Goodman's music came out, there was a sort of a new movement called Yiddish swing that began to take over. The most famous song from that, of course, by Mir Bist Du Shane, which was originally a song from the Yiddish theater, and it's the history behind that. It was written by Shalom Secunda, I think in 1932. It had a nice little run in the theater, but it wasn't a well-known tune. But a few years later, at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, two black entertainers, Johnny and George, came out and sang that song in Yiddish and blew the crowd away. And it was a huge hit. In the audience at the Apollo Theater was Sammy Kahn, a very well-known lyricist and producer, and he thought that this was going to be a great hit if he could get a hold of it. So he apparently went to Shalom Secunda and paid him for the rights to the song. Now, there's a sort of a story that he paid, at that time he paid, I think it was $30, which was still a fairly good amount of money at that time. But, of course, the song went on to a great fame and made lots of money. And in fact, Sammy Kahn later said that he was able to buy a house for his mother with all the money that he made from buying Mir Bist Du Shane. But Shalom Secunda, of course, was a little annoyed. And Shalom Secunda's mother apparently went to the synagogue every day for 25 years, asking God for forgiveness, certain that he was punishing her son for a sin that she had committed, a good Jewish mother. The song actually became a hit all across Europe, even into Germany during as Hitler was rising up, because they didn't realize that the song was in Yiddish. They thought it was a German dialect. But by Mir Bist Du Shane, just a really powerful song. After that, there was And the Angels Sing, another wonderful song that's based upon a klezmer tune that was written by Ziggy Elman, who was the trumpeter in the Benny Goodman band. What was his name again?
Harry Finkelman.
It was actually Harry Finkelman was his real name. And then there was another one, Yosel Yosel, that became Joseph Joseph. So one of these days we'll do another concert where we can play these pieces and see how they went from the klezmer world into that jazz world. Now, we're going to finish up with another wonderful work. This is by a Hungarian clarinetist named Béla Kovács, who I believe is still alive, born in 1937. And he was a young phenom, started playing with the Budapest Opera when he was 19 years old, studied at the Franz Liszt Academy. He founded the Budapest Chamber Ensemble, and I think still teaches at the Liszt Academy. He's written some really wonderful clarinet works, very virtuoso works. And this one is especially fun. It's called Shalom Aleichem Rav Feidman, which means peace be with you, Master Feidman. And in this case, the Feidman is Giora Feidman, widely considered one of the greats of the klezmer clarinetists. He was born in 1936 in Argentina, where his parents had fled, and then he eventually emigrated to Israel, and I think he became the youngest clarinetist to play with the Israel Philharmonic when he was 18 years old. So he had a whole classical career, but he really loved playing klezmer music, and he's really helped him with the klezmer revival. And this piece will, it starts off very slow and dark and kind of sad, and then makes its way through some happier times, and at the end you'll all be dancing on your chairs if you want to, so go ahead. And after this, we have some wonderful food and drink that my daughter Sophie has put out there, so head on out there and get some of that.
Thank